The wide receiver landscape has changed dramatically in the past 3 seasons because we've had 3 straight years of phenomenal rookie wide receiver classes. Now, that's actually going to be something that changes this season, where it seems like we are flipping the script where the rookie wide receivers coming in are a lot weaker than the rookie running backs, which is not what we have seen over the past few years. But regardless, I want to go through and I want to include the rookie picks into our Dynasty rankings. That way you can have a good sense of how you should be valuing rookie picks in your Dynasty trades at this moment. Now, Tier 1, obviously, these are the guys that if you have, you can safely bank on them being wide receiver ones, not only for this next season, but for years to come. Jamar Chase just put up the best year of his NFL career and arguably the best wide receiver season that we had this year at 24 years old. I mean, this is a player that comes through and gives you the monstrous 23.7 points per game. The only higher 24-year-old season that we have seen since the year 2000 was actually CeeDee Lamb in 2023 with 23.8 points per game. A big difference between these two guys I want to point out is CeeDee Lamb in 2023 had absolutely no target competition, whereas Jamar Chase had plenty of it. Now, of course, with Chase, the big thing to be on the lookout for is he needs to get paid this offseason, and T. Higgins needs to get paid. Joe Burrow just got paid, so I'm going to assume that they probably can't pay both receivers. And I'm going to assume that they are keeping Chase and Higgins, maybe actually walking elsewhere, which could vault up Chase to have an even higher ceiling this next season. Now, going over to Jefferson. Jefferson, phenomenal year. I mean, if you remember, this is a receiver that in redraft leagues, people were worried about the situation with Darnold, and he comes through and he actually gets 18.5 fantasy points per game at 25 years old. I mean, he already had his big contract extension, right? $110 million guaranteed. He's going to be with Minnesota for years to come. Seems like all signs point to J.J. McCarthy being the guy. Phenomenal coaching staff. Some could make the argument the most talented wide receiver in the NFL. Only 25. Nothing's really changing here. CeeDee Lamb, not much is going to change. He already got his contract extension, of course. You're really just hoping that Dak Prescott's going to be fully healthy going into this next season, and then you can get back to the Lamb up closer to 24 points per game, which is what we saw in his age 24 year. Looking at Puka Nacua, I understand maybe it's a little bit aggressive to put him here, and keep in mind, I massively whiffed on Puka 2 years ago, probably the most embarrassing thing I've ever done, and I've done quite a few embarrassing things, but we can't deny the fact that Puka Nacua puts up the best rookie wide receiver season of all time, and he follows that up with the phenomenal second year as well. You actually have 19 fantasy points per game, and if we go through and if we look at the most comparable season since the year 2000 to what Puka Nacua was able to do at 23 years old, you have names like CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Odell Beckham Jr., Brandon Marshall, Chris Godwin, Anquan Bolden, Keenan Allen, David Moss. Really just phenomenal names all throughout the list. I will talk about Cooper Kupp at the very end of this video, but it seems like Kupp is just absolutely dusted at this point. So, yeah, I think that Puka Nacua continues to expand his market share numbers in this offense this next year. Don't know how much longer you have Stafford, but I'm confident in the offense because of McVay regardless. And then going over and looking at Malik Neighbors, if you wanted to put Malik Neighbors ahead of Kupp, I'm not going to fault you for it. The only difference is I don't think you can be as confident with the Giants offense, and it may not necessarily matter because the Giants just arguably had the worst offense in the league this past year, and Malik Neighbors still managed to average 18.1 fantasy points per game. What is actually insane is if you go through and look at the best age 21-year-old seasons that we have seen since the year 2000, you have Malik Neighbors at 18.1 fantasy points a game, Jamar Chase at 18, Jamar Chase had Joe Burrow, Justin Jefferson at 17.1, Mike Evans at 16.3, Juju Smith-Schuster at 14.7, Keenan Allen at 14.3, then Brandon Cooks, Amari, Lamb, and Jeremy Maclin. So just absolutely phenomenal what we had with Malik Neighbors. The Giants have a top pick this next year, but of course does not guarantee that they're going to be able to get a quarterback. Now going over to tier 2, I know a lot of people are upset that we did not put Brian Thomas in the same tier as Malik Neighbors in the last video. Frankly, I don't understand how you could even make that argument. 1, Brian Thomas is a year older. 2, Malik Neighbors was the better wide receiver at LSU. 3, go over to the prospect page that we have over on flockfantasy.com, and you actually play around with some of those statistics that we have, and you can see exactly how good of a prospect Malik Neighbors was. Brian Thomas was phenomenal in his own right. But regardless, Brian Thomas puts up a phenomenal rookie season, just not to the same extent that you had from Neighbors. Brian Thomas gives you 16.5 fantasy points per game. And yeah, it was a phenomenal year. At age 22 years old, the closest comps are DeAndre Hopkins, David Boston, CeeDee Lamb, Julio Jones, Brandon Cooks, T. Higgins, Amari Cooper, Sammy Watkins, Michael Clayton. So I think that Brian Thomas is arguably the most impressive rookie in terms of where he was in rookie drafts last season in comparison to what he did in year one. I just don't think you can put him in the same tier as Neighbors, where Neighbors scored more points in a worse situation at a younger age and was a better prospect overall. Amon-Ra St. Brown will be our next guy. St. Brown, phenomenal. Just difference is St. Brown just played his age 25 season, right? So if you are a contending team and you wanted to say, oh, okay, well, I'd rather take St. Brown over Brian Thomas, we know St. Brown's going to be drafted higher in redraft leagues this next year. Completely fine with it. It's just that you're getting a couple extra years with Thomas himself. And with Amon-Ra St. Brown, there's not really much to talk about here whatsoever. Maybe the change with the offensive coordinator is going to be something to continue to monitor. But again, if you actually looked at sports books all year long, they're projecting the Detroit Lions to be the highest scoring offense week in and week out. Even if that comes down to earth just a bit, it should still be a top 5 scoring offense. Looking at Nico Collins, will be super interesting to see what the Houston Texans do at wide receiver in the offseason. And Nico, absolutely dominant from a per-game perspective at 17.5 points. Big issue is, of course, Nico gets hurt, Dell gets hurt, and Diggs gets hurt. Diggs was on the 1-year prove-it deal as well. So you can't necessarily pencil in Stephon Diggs to be a Houston Texan this next season. I don't know if you see Tank Dell for a single snap this next year. So I think that this is more likely than not going to be an offense that 100% is looking to bring somebody in. And Nico Collins is a little bit on the older side as well. Just played his age 25-year-old season. He should be drafted near Amon-Ra St. Brown in redraft leagues. Going over to the next tier, Drake London just put up like 1,200 receiving yards as a 23-year-old. I know it's a little bit funny to see that London is this young, but London was drafted at 20 years old back in 2022. So, I mean, if you actually project this going into the future, Drake London has phenomenal comps for what he was able to do at 23 years old. His comps include Lamb, Chase, St. Brown, Larry Fitz, Marquise Colson, Calvin Johnson, Stephon Diggs, Hakeem Nicks, Andre Johnson. And I know we are expecting to have a lot of passing volume here in Atlanta, but in reality, outside of maybe 2 games, Kirk Cousins was underwhelming, and I don't necessarily think you can assume that Michael Penix is going to be worse this next year. I think base expectation should probably be that Michael Penix is a little bit of a better option than what you actually had with Kirk Cousins. And anyway, this is the last year that you actually have Drake London signed to the Atlanta Falcons unless they decide to use that 5th-year option, which they probably will. But more likely than not, I'm actually going to assume that you do see some contract conversations probably next offseason, to be honest. I'm going over and looking at Marvin Harrison Jr. and Ladd McConkey back-to-back. 100%, if you want to flip Ladd over Harrison, not going to fault you for it whatsoever, right? If you're looking at Harrison, he was a significantly better prospect. There's a reason that one of these players goes in the top 5 of the NFL draft. Almost any metric that you're going to look at in general, literally just go to the prospects page on flockfantasy.com and you can find all of that information. And of course, if y'all wanted to check out all these rankings from a 1 quarterback perspective so you can see where the rookie picks line up, because all the rookie picks are going to be for Superflex leagues here. Or if you want to go check out Trade Calculator, Trade Finder, prospects page, if you want to get your exact Dynasty League uploaded and view team-by-team power rankings, you do all that on flockfantasy.com. If you're not already a member of the site, you can find a link in the description or comment section. And if you use code FLOCK, you'll get 30% off any subscription, and I will look at your team when you join the site and get you that personalized podcast. But nonetheless, looking at Harrison, super disappointing in that he was drafted in round 1 of redraft leagues, at least on Underdog Fantasy. But he comes through more like a wide receiver 3 in fantasy year 1, which I know that is extremely frustrating for the price that you paid, but for a 22-year-old rookie, his comps are great. Like, realistically speaking, at the 3.5 receptions a game, you get about 7 targets a game, 52 receiving yards a game, plays all 17 weeks, and he averages nearly 12 points per game in full PPR formats. And if you go through and look at the historical comps for these 22-year-old rookies, you had Calvin Johnson, Drake London in year 2. Keep in mind, London was in year 2 at 22 years old. Deshaun Jackson, Stephon Diggs, Andre Johnson, Dez Bryant. Then you had some busts on this list. You have Dante Moncrief, which had dynasty value at one point. Torrey Smith, Robert Woods. I mean, really no bust whatsoever. So I still think the range of outcomes is phenomenal with Harrison. This was a great prospect. This was a decent rookie season. I think the issue was the expectations that people had on him year one rather than what he actually did himself. Going over and looking at what we have with Ladd McConkey, on the other hand, Ladd McConkey exceeded expectations dramatically in redraft and best ball leagues. He was a league winner. And in Dynasty leagues, he went from somebody who took at the end of the first round, beginning of the second round, to now being a cornerstone asset for your team going into the future. He had a better rookie season than what you actually had with Marvin Harrison, averaging about 15 points per game. Now, of course, I do want to put a little asterisk on this. The Ladd McConkey was 23 years old at this time, and Ladd McConkey had zero target competition whatsoever in his offense. The comps are still phenomenal. Tyreek, AJ Green, DJ Moore, Brandon Cooks, Jeremy Maclin, T. Higgins, Sidney Rice. You maybe have a bust in here with DJ Chark, but we're going to overlook that. But ultimately, going into the future, I'm just going to take the sample that we have with a better prospect profile with Harrison rather than what you have with Ladd. But if you wanted to switch it, I wouldn't fault you at all. And especially if you wanted to go through, if you wanted to throw JSN ahead of either one of these guys, going to be completely fine with it. I wish that I would have doubled down. I wish that we would have gone through and said buy low, buy low, buy low on JSN after his rookie season. Sadly, I was not smart enough to do that. Sadly, after he face plants his rookie, I go through and go, okay, well, if you look at the historical data, it's not great, but we loved him as a prospect because y'all have heard me say it 1,000 times at this point. He was more productive at Ohio State than Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson on the same roster when Olave was a senior, Wilson was a junior, and JSN was a sophomore. And JSN outproduced them dramatically. And JSN finally gets the playing time. You see the offensive coordinator change in Seattle this past year. And JSN, you get the year two breakout, averaging about 15.2 fantasy points per game. Still incredibly young. He just played this year too at 22 years old. So he actually is younger than Ladd McConkey. And going into the future, at least with how I'm going to be drafting these guys in redraft leagues next year, I'll be taking Jackson Smith and Jigba ahead of DK Metcalf, which I think that should be, a very easy take at this point. And yeah, he was a phenomenal prospect in his own right. And great year two at a very young age. Now going over and looking at A.J. Brown, I know maybe A.J. Brown seems a little low in these rankings, but a big thing is you're only interested if you're a contending roster. Like there's no world in which a rebuilding team's going to go through and going to pay up for 28-year-old A.J. Brown. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a receiver that is playing in a rush-first offense that's going to dominate market share numbers. If you were looking at what we can expect for next year and the year after, it's stupid simple. He's going to be with the Philadelphia Eagles if you look at the contract. He averaged 16.5 fantasy points per game this past season. He was right around that mark the year before. You can pretty much pencil in A.J. Brown to be a boom-bust low-end wide receiver one in fantasy for the next few seasons. Now, of course, the issue is that's only going to be valuable for about half your league, where if the other half is looking to actually play for the long haul, A.J. Brown is going to be the declining asset and worth less next offseason than he is this offseason no matter what. Now, going over and looking at Garrett Wilson just simply did not get any better. I don't want to throw him under the bus, but y'all remember Corey in the Flock League took Wilson ahead of Jefferson. Just absolutely brutal. But anyway, the situation this next year, no idea what it's going to be. I know a lot of people think you're going to get the Lions defensive coordinator going over to be that coach. Maybe by the time this video's come out, that news is official. But in terms of quarterback play, you most likely have Rodgers. Realistically speaking, the efficiency wasn't there this past season. Now, of course, if Devontae Adams is gone, Garrett Wilson could presumably lead the NFL in targets. So maybe for fantasy purposes, it just frankly does not matter. If we are going to look at Wilson, the historical comps at 24 years old are decent, not great. You have like Deontay Johnson, Jarvis Landry, Devonta Smith, Hollywood Brown, Kendall Wright, Steve Smith, Dwayne Bowe, DJ Moore, Juju Smith-Schuster. So, you're more so looking at the wide receiver 2 prototype, but he's younger than A.J. Brown. And obviously, this is somebody that can be worth more 12 months from now if you do get the bounce back. I'm going over and looking at T. Higgins. I actually drafted a crap ton of T. Higgins in best ball drafts this past year, and I do have a decent amount of him in Dynasty, but a lot of that's from years ago. But regardless, I really liked Higgins in this Cincinnati Bengals offense in particular, strictly because the passing volume and the concentration of targets that you're going to have. I know that there's going to be a subsection of people that will convince themselves that T. Higgins going to Carolina or T. Higgins going to any bad offense where he doesn't have to deal with Jamar Chase could be a good thing. The reality of the situation is that'd be a horrible thing. you would much prefer to have the passing volume in Cincinnati for Higgins rather than him going to a low volume passing attack and seeing higher market share numbers. And if you're looking at the contract situation, I know they're going to try to make it work, but realistically, to pay Chase, to pay Burrow, as I'm assuming your top two priorities, Chase is going to be the highest wide receiver in the league in terms of dollars spent. I don't know if you can fit Higgins on this roster. So I think you have a big risk with Higgins in terms of who he's playing for this next year. Rashee Rice, the risk is suspension. I mean, we know that the NFL, frankly, does not really care about these incidents unless they are forced to. I mean, they kind of swept the Jordan Addison situation under the rug, where a lot of people thought that Addison was going to face a suspension in late 2024. But the Rashee Rice instance, everybody was saying that the suspension's coming in 2025. At least that's what they were saying last offseason. Of course, the further you get removed from the incidents, the less and less people are going to make noise about it. It's just the way the world works. I mean, at 24 years old, the dude averaged 21.5 fantasy points a game. He looked like he was going to be a league winner, but he's coming off significant injuries, facing a potential suspension. So it's just very difficult to rank him. Going over and looking at another player that we thought was going to get suspended last year, Jordan Addison. I mean, this was my number one guy in best ball drafts, and thank God he came through for us. Averaged about 14.5 fantasy points per game, and honestly, did so in a very interesting situation where your quarterback's Darnold, and you have to compete with Jefferson for targets all season. Now, going into this next year, a lot of this hinges on McCarthy with the passing volume that you can expect for this Vikings offense. And a big thing I want to point out here as well, somebody who's been a big-time believer in Addison's still incredibly young, I still want to bet on the dude, is you're also going to have a fully healthy TJ Hawkinson all season. So Hawkinson being healthy all year is going to be a concern. If you go through and you look at the historical comps, you have some pretty nice names on this list for 22-year-old seasons that were similar. You have guys like Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, Stephon Diggs, Andre Johnson, Jeremy Maclin, George Pickens, Chase Claypool, Darius Slayton, Jordan Addison, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. just had a similar year as well. Now, frankly, you do have bust on this list as well, which is why we can't go through and put Addison in the same range as like London or Ladd. Devonta Smith will be the next receiver. With Smith, I mean, at this point, he's kind of aging into a range where you're really only wanting him on a contending team, which is crazy to say. It doesn't seem like he's been around for that long, but he stayed a decent amount of time at Alabama. He didn't come out into the NFL until I believe he was 22. So he just played this past season at 26 years old. Low volume passing attack that wants to rush first. I'm going over and looking at our next receiver. Also, a rush first offense with Zay Flowers. And we just have seen time and time again that you're not going to get the consistent passing volume, particularly to the wide receiver position with Lamar Jackson. That's not his game. Zay Flowers has a really good market share here in this offense this past year. Baltimore looks great, but still at the end of the day, you're only averaging 12.5 fantasy points, but still pretty young. George Pickens, really young too, right? He just played this past season at 23 years old. But Pickens, you don't really know what the quarterback situation is going to be. And just Pittsburgh has been stuck in this absolute dumpster fire with the quarterback position for years because they're always good enough to not get a good pick, but they are never in a situation where they can bring over somebody that's going to make a significant difference. So I don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be for Pickens this next season. I know he makes highlight grabs, but realistically, he get 12 fantasy points per game this past season. Rome Odunze will be our next guy. Obviously, you like Ben Johnson coming over to be the offensive coordinator in Chicago. You also really like the fact that you don't have Keenan Allen as that big of a threat. I don't know if Allen's going to be with the Bears. I mean, if you look at Allen's age, I don't necessarily think that we can say that he would make a difference regardless. But to be fair with Rome Odunze, he did have an absolute garbage rookie season. If you're looking at historical comparables at age 22, Rome Odunze comp to Travis Taylor, Hollywood Brown, Corey Davis, Romeo Doubs, Titus Young, Tavon Austin, Tyler Boyd, Marlon Brown, Ace Sanders. I mean, none of these guys really did anything at all in their age 23 season. But again, similar to Jackson Smith and Jigba, you see the situation changing. If you really like the prospect profile, might as well go in on it. Looking at Chris Olave really does kind of flame out here. You only have him averaging about 10 fantasy points per game this past season. And similar to the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Saints are never bad enough to actually get themselves a decent quarterback. You don't necessarily know what that situation is going to be this next year. And at the same time with Olave, you're going to have to deal with concussions for years to come. I'm going over and looking at Xavier Worthy. I actually don't mind the idea of buying Xavier Worthy on the cheap whatsoever. You actually get the 11.5 fantasy points per game this past year. You look at Kelsey. Kelsey, I believe, is going to be 36 years old. So realistically speaking, would not be surprised at all if the Chiefs win the Super Bowl this year. Travis Kelsey retires after. I know that's what people have been saying for years. You can check the record. It's my first time saying it. So I think there is that outside chance Kelsey retires. DeAndre Hopkins isn't with the Chiefs this next year. You're really just looking at Xavier Worthy as well as Rashee Rice. And with Worthy, I mean, at 21 years old, had a respectable season, 11.5 fantasy points per game, and have some pretty decent comps on this list. Like JSN had a similar rookie season. DeAndre Hopkins had a similar age 21 year as well. Jameson Williams will be our next guy. With Jameson up at 13.5 fantasy points per game, I'm almost more worried about the departure of Ben Johnson for Jameson than I am Amon-Ra St. Brown. Honestly, I could just be making that up in my head. I don't know why that would be valid. But if you were looking at Jameson Williams, this is going to be a receiver that his last year under contract should be in 2025. And again, a little bit more of that boom-bust prototype, but it was nice seeing him command more targets this past season. I'm going over and looking at DJ Moore. Based off Ben Johnson coming over, we may end up having to move DJ Moore up higher on this list. DJ Moore, another one of these names that came into the NFL incredibly young and produced right away as a rookie, so it seems like he's been around forever, but he's going to be only playing his age 28 season this next year. And if you look at what DJ Moore was able to accomplish this past year at 27, you have some guys in their age 28 years seeing the absolute blow-ups after. You actually have a similar 27-year-old season for Cooper Kupp, and then Kupp, with the ascension of the Rams offense, actually blew up to 25 fantasy points per game that following year at 28 years old. You had the Godwin blow up to about 20 fantasy points per game the following year. You had the Eric Decker blow up going up to about 17 fantasy points per game the following year. So if you have no Keenan, especially if you're not a Rome Odunze believer and you think that Ben Johnson's going to be able to fix this offense, you actually can move DJ Moore up these ranks. I'm going over and looking at Jalen Waddle. Waddle got paid, and it looks like this dude just does not care. I don't know what's going on. Realistically speaking, this is the worst year of Waddle's NFL career. Does not hit 10 fantasy points per game. Tough to take too much away from it, of course. Frankly, you had Tua missing a significant amount of time, but Waddle didn't do anything when Tua came back. But you also may not have Tyreek, so it's going to be something to monitor. DK Metcalf, at 13 fantasy points per game, but I mean, I had this dude on my team in the Flock League, at least in the second half of the season. Felt like he did absolutely nothing, trailed off where you ended up seeing the majority of that volume going through Jackson Smith and Jigba. And if you actually look at the contract situation, it's a very realistic outcome that 2025 is Metcalf's last year with Seattle. I'm going over and looking at Terry McLaurin. Jaden Daniels looks like one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL at this point. Terry McLaurin's been fully unlocked. Terry McLaurin is his best year of his NFL career by far at 29 years old. So McLaurin's going to be 30 this next season, and that's a big issue with McLaurin as he just came out of Ohio State at such an old age. I think he played his rookie year at 24. So, I mean, he already is near that tail end. Chris Godwin, I mean, phenomenal year at 28 years old, should only be 29. It's actually funny is Godwin's younger than McLaurin, despite McLaurin being drafted 2019, Godwin being drafted 2017. But regardless, I think we're going to assume that Godwin is fully healthy going into this next year. I know that you have some turnover with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coaching staff, but realistically, if Evans is another year older and you actually see the market share numbers go up for Godwin, it could be a positive. I'm going over and looking at Jaden Reed. I mean, my issue with Jaden Reed all along, at least this past season, is the volume was frankly just never there, right? So you average about 12 fantasy points per game, but this is off of 4.5 targets. Like, there are very few instances where you can actually find comparable seasons. Now, the guys that you can find to have comparable seasons, Golden Tate, Kenny Stills, Mike Williams, Terrence Williams, Jerry Porter, Gabe Davis, Reggie Williams, Isaiah Hodgins, and Alec Pierce, all at 24 years old. Did any of these guys at age 25 come out and light the world on fire? Nope. The best guy was Golden Tate at 11.5 fantasy points a game. So I don't necessarily know. Obviously, you can say that, oh, Jordan Love has the talent. This is an offense that if they change their mindset, maybe the passing volume could go up. But Jaden Reed's not out there running a ton of routes, not seeing a ton of volume, so it's just difficult. Looking over at Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill sees the massive fall off. At 30 years old, you only have him averaging about 12.5 fantasy points per game. And obviously, you have the natural assumption that these receivers going from age 30 to 31 are going to get worse. If we actually look at all the closest comparables since the year 2000, out of the 10 closest comparables, you actually had 7 of them get worse from age 30 to 31. That's the natural trend that you're going to have with these guys. And one thing that I'm very concerned about with the fall off with Tyreek is, one, how steep of a fall off it was, and 2, the fact that Tyreek is a wide receiver that is historically won with athleticism. And if a wide receiver that historically wins with speed and athleticism loses that, all of a sudden, is he just completely toast? Looking at Brandon Ayuk, I think that you're going to have to be concerned that, I don't know, Ayuk's completely toast. I mean, I know that you can maybe blame the injury and say, okay, you would have had a good year, blah, blah, blah. The dude had one game with over 10 fantasy points this season. He was averaging about 8.5 fantasy points per game. Juwan Jennings was better from start to finish. Now, the good thing with Brandon Ayuk is you don't necessarily know the status of Deebo Samuel in San Francisco this next year. We know the status with Ayuk because he just got paid. He has guaranteed money, and he's going to be a Niner in 2025 as well as 2026. So you know Ayuk's a Niner. Deebo may not be, but Ayuk just looks so damn bad. There's the outside chance that it was due to just limited time in training camp, of course. I'm going over and looking at Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy has arguably the best year of his NFL career, averaged about 14 fantasy points per game. This after getting $41 million guaranteed from Cleveland. We can assume that Jeudy is a very safe bet to make this roster in 2025 and 2026. A big issue is you just don't necessarily know if you can pencil in the same type of passing volume for this Browns offense if they move away from Flacco. The issue with Jeudy is we don't necessarily know what the quarterback situation is going to be, and a lot of this volume came in when you had Winston, which we're going to assume that Winston's not the quarterback for Cleveland this next year. And then with Downs, the same issue is a lot of this production came when you had Flacco under center when the passing volume was actually there. And he looked damn good for a 23-year-old receiver. I mean, some of these comps are great. I mean, you have Des Bryant here as a comp. But a big issue is with Anthony Richardson under center, we have seen zero signs that Anthony Richardson will ever be able to support a fantasy viable wide receiver. So that's going to be your main concern. Going over and looking at Courtland Sutton. Sutton was phenomenal with Bo Nix. Best season of his NFL career by far, averaging about 15 fantasy points per game. Did so at 29. It's going to be 30 this next year. So obviously more so just a contending piece, but a very safe bet to both be on the Broncos while at the same time be the alpha target for Bo Nix, in that you don't necessarily have to be too concerned about anybody in the draft here. Going over and looking at the duo, or maybe we throw in a bunch of rookie wide receivers coming up. If I'm having to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to go Ricky Pearsall. He flashed at the very end of the season, and obviously I think we can give him the benefit of the doubt in that he got shot coming into the year. He was a round 1 draft pick. We had other reports saying that the Chiefs would have taken him in round 1 as well. So I don't know. I'm going to give Ricky Pearsall the benefit of the doubt here with these ranks. Then we're going to go with Keon Coleman just because he's attached to a phenomenal quarterback. Followed up with Mike Evans. Mike Evans at 31 years old, I mean, just continues to print phenomenal seasons. Averages 17 fantasy points per game. And if you go through and look at the closest comparables that we had at 31 years old, you had Joe Horn, Randy Moss, Hines Ward, Eddie Kinnison, Roddy White, Emmanuel Sanders, Julio Jones, Curtis Conway. And if we're looking at what these guys did going into their age 32 seasons, there are only 2 receivers that were able to improve from a points per game perspective. That was Randy Moss from 2008 to 2009, and that was Joe Horn from 2003 and 2004. So frankly, it's just the fact of the matter that age is going to catch up with Evans, which is disappointing. Shakir, honestly, I think you can move ahead of Evans. I know that Shakir had some flash plays. I know a lot of people were very excited about him, but I do want to just call a spade a spade. I mean, the dude averaged 12 fantasy points per game, right? So with Shakir, it was fine, but I mean, if you're a 24-year-old wide receiver averaging 12 fantasy points per game, I think a lot of that is just based off situation. Going over and looking at Quentin Johnston averaged about the same amount of points per game as Shakir with 11.7. And Johnston was only 23 years old. So honestly, I'm making an entire dedicated video about JSN and Quentin Johnston as well. But it is really surprising to see just the straight up face plant that you had from Johnston and kind of JSN in year 1, obviously not to the same extent, and to get that bounce back in year 2, mainly with JSN, a little bit with Johnston here. Leggett, former round 1 pick, should have a safe role this next season. The question is any good? Probably not. McMillan maybe expands his target share with Evans aging. Jacoby Myers, stupid steady, right? 14.5 fantasy points. Issue is going to be a garbage offense where you're capped to being the second best option here, kind of regardless, and you're that aging asset, 29 years old, so you're really only for a contending team, and if you are a super strong contender, how much is Myers actually going to help? Going over and looking at Devontae Adams, just played his age 32-year-old season right. And again, just kind of the same situation that you have with Evans. If you look at the best historical comps, the only two guys that actually improved from age 32 to 33 were Ed McCaffrey from 2000 to 2001 and Marvin Harrison from 2004 to 2005. So he's just going to get older. We don't know the situation he'll be in. I'm looking at Michael Pittman. No passing volume. Pittman at 27 years old, just averaged 10.5 fantasy points per game. This dude's done. Deebo Samuel, done, toasted, right? You had every opportunity in the world. No CMC, no Brandon Ayuk. You did nothing with it. And at the same time, you look at the contract situation, very real out that they don't play with Deebo this next year. And then looking at Kupp, it looks like Kupp is done and dusted as well. 31 years old, absolutely trails off at the end of the season. Looking at the contract situation, I think that there's almost a 0% chance that Kupp's with this team in 2026. Maybe they let him play it out in 2025. But, ultimately, you see this fall off at 31. I don't know at 32 if it's getting any better. But I really hope I was able to help you out. Of course, I'm going to be updating my rankings constantly. If you want to check out my rankings, the rankings from the guys at Domain, Land, FSC, whoever you want, or if you want to use the fantasy trade calculator, if you want to go through and if you want to look at that rookie prospect database, whatever you're wanting, it's over on flockfantasy.com. You can find that link in the description or the comment section. And if you use code FLOCK, you'll get 30% off any subscription. Plus, I'll go through and make that personalized podcast of your Dynasty team when you join. But I think that's all I got for you. Really appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the next video.